WCNC Charlotte. This is Flashpoint.
Thanks for joining us here on Flashpoint. I'm Ben Thompson. A seismic shift in Carolina politics in the last week or so. And it's a shift you probably didn't even notice because it's been years in the making. New numbers show more voters in North Carolina are now registered as unaffiliated versus Republican or Democrats. Of North Carolina's roughly 7.2 million voters, about 35% of them are registered unaffiliated by just a hair, compared to 34% who are registered Democrats and 30% who are registered Republicans, proving North Carolina is indeed a purple state. Joining us today to break it all down for us, Catawba College professor, friend of the show, Dr. Michael Bitzer. Doctor, thanks for coming on as always. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right, so registered unaffiliated voters now have a slight edge on Democrats in the state, I think by just about a few hundred votes. It's not that many people. Much larger advantage over Republicans. Is this a moment in time, flash in the pan sort of thing, or is this the trend that's happening?
This has been the trend that has been happening for several decades now. Registered unaffiliateds here in North Carolina and really across the country have been rising in comparison to the partisans, Democrats and Republicans. Back in September of 2017, in North Carolina, unaffiliated surpassed Republicans to become the second largest bloc. This week, we have unaffiliated surpassing Democrats as the largest bloc of the 7.2 million registered voters in the state. So this is trending as the nation is trending. However, I would be very reticent to say that all of these unaffiliateds are pure independents. Most of them would be, I think, closeted partisans. They just don't like the party label, or perhaps they are wanting other things other than what the two parties are offering.
So why did somebody change their affiliation to unaffiliated? Beyond the idea of that they actually truly are independent, what would be the reasons?
Well, I think one of the reasons here in North Carolina is that unaffiliateds have the opportunity to pick one party's primary over the other. We've got a primary election coming up in May. Unaffiliateds can make the decision as to whether they want to vote in the Democratic primary or the Republican primary. If you are a registered partisan, you're not allowed to vote in the other party's primary.
What does this mean specifically for Democrats and for two, Republican?
What I know from the research that I've done about voting behavior is that these unaffiliateds tend to lean slightly Republican, so that there is a slight advantage among this unaffiliated pool of voters to the Republican Party. That's something Democrats are going to have to be concerned about. The other aspect for the Democrats is that these unaffiliated voters tend to be overwhelmingly under the age of 40. Registered unaffiliated voters among millennials, and particularly now Gen Z, has been the majority and plurality of those registered voters of those cohorts. And if the national dynamics of those younger voters tend to trend in ways that are beneficial to Democrats, we could see a slight change moving forward as generations tend to replace themselves. The big concern, however, for registered unaffiliateds, they don't show up at rates comparable to registered partisans. They are always below the state average in terms of turnout rates in elections. So while the bulk of the registered voters may be unaffiliated, they just don't care to show up as much as registered Democrats and registered Republicans.
Do these numbers have any real world ramifications when it comes to our elected bodies? Is anything decided on these numbers?
Well, I think certainly in some districts, particularly state legislative, perhaps congressional district, if you look at the pool of who the voters are in those districts, unaffiliateds are becoming the significant chunk of voters, and that makes it harder for the candidates to try and figure out who and where their party loyalties lie. Now, you can decipher some things, but when it comes to actually electing individuals, I think we are still going to have the two major parties, Democrats and Republicans, join and really be the most predominant of the elected officials. There's been a call for a third party. There's always claims that the two parties don't represent a lot of voters, but unaffiliateds just don't seem to be energized as much to register and to get onto the ballot as independent candidates. That could change in the future, but for right now, we're stuck with the two major parties.
And even though this is a big sort of seismic shift in politics here in North Carolina, and unaffiliated outnumbering registered Democrats and Republicans, we do not make it easy for unaffiliated candidates.
Correct. The process for getting on the ballot is extremely difficult. And so I think that that's going to be a continued hindrance for independent candidates. If these unaffiliateds are true independents and want different things from the two parties, it's going to be hard for their voices to be represented at the table.
Explain why we don't have evenly split legislative bodies.
Well, yeah, the particular dynamic, and that's a great question. The particular dynamic is the fact that we elect single individuals from single member districts. And if you win, say, 51% of the vote out of that district, you get 100% of that seat. So by just basic normative standards, whoever wins within a district is going to get the disproportionate share of that seat, meaning 100%. That tends to stack the deck already for those parties that tend to win the majority of the seats. They overwin in terms of their actual seats. So that's just part of the natural dynamic. It's part of the election system. Single members, you win more than the person who comes in second, one more vote than the person who comes in second, you get 100% of that seat.
What does this say about the rural red parts of North Carolina and the blue urban parts of North Carolina? And how do these unaffiliated fit into those?
Well, certainly from some of the research that I've done in terms of precincts, we know that in rural counties, they are moving more and more Republican. In the urban core areas like Charlotte, like Raleigh, it's becoming deeper and deeper blue. 70% of all the precincts across North Carolina are landslide precincts, meaning that they vote for one party over the other by 60%. Only 15% of all of the state's precincts are competitive, within 50 to 55. So the dynamic of unaffiliateds, if you happen to live within one of these landslide precincts, you're probably voting for that particular political party.
If Democrats live in cities and Republicans live in the more rural parts, which again, oversimplification, then where do the unaffiliateds live?
They live actually across all of the areas, all of the regions. So urban suburbs, along with the central cities, the surrounding suburban areas, the rural areas. Actually, registered unaffiliateds are fairly distributed across all of those four different regions of the state. So that makes them an important component where registered Democrats tend to be in central cities, Republicans tend to be in the surrounding suburban counties and the rural counties.
Interesting, very interesting. All right, Professor Bitzer, thank you as always. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
More Flashpoint after this.